Hi Ruby, you did a nice job with your series, and I'm glad that you made your own lens. Certainly working with a body cap to begin with is going to be a lot easier than trying to fashion one out of other pieces because of the light leaks, and that's exactly what you saw. However, your use of the electrical tape to work past that seemed to work pretty well because the overall exposures that we're getting for your series are very good. Some of the images are sharper than others. I think that the likelihood is that I think there's two things. First of all, longer exposures, sometimes you have a little bit of camera movement. And I think we see that here. You can tell that we've got basically ghosting on these specular highlights. That's indicative. And I think also what happened is that your lens slipped a little bit. So between your flowers here and your still life with your this urn, for example, I think that this is in better overall position, and so you have a little bit sharper image because of that. Overall, I think that, for sure, they're all fine. The aesthetic of the pinhole is not about perfection. We see, well, before we get to that, you included in your photos of making your lens one raw file. And because you included that, I wanted to share with the class what happens with a raw file. Because it's a raw file, it means basically that it is unprocessed data, and you need to have a raw processor in order for it to be recognized as a photograph. So if you just look at it on your phone, for example, it wouldn't recognize that as an image file. If we try to bring it into Photoshop, what happens first is the camera raw application, it's kind of a mini application within Photoshop, will open up first, and it allows you to tweak settings, and we can change the clarity, the exposure, whatever. What's important for everybody to understand is with a JPEG, think of it as a fixed volume. You can only fit so much into it. However, if you have a raw photograph, you have much more latitude. And so we can change the exposure up to 5 stops. So basically, in terms of the histogram, once we reach this limit of the highlights and the shadows, that's just it if you have a JPEG. Because this is a raw photograph, we're able to change the way that was initially defined, and that becomes the image. So it's a very, very powerful tool for photographers to use, and so I think that's just kind of neat. The other thing is, of course, you've got your wedding ring here, and it's beautiful, so you got to comment on that kind of beauty when you see it. So once you open it, by mistake I had placed it within this image itself. If I had not tried to drag it onto the urn, then it would have opened up as its own separate image once it was past the Adobe Camera Raw. So getting back to your series, you have 7 images, and we only needed 6. And so when you have that, it's really important to learn how to self-edit as a photographer. Self-editing is really tough, and you find images that you love for different reasons. Sometimes you like the look of it. Sometimes you just enjoyed the experience of making it so well that it can be hard to call. So looking through here, we have basically 2 sets of portfolios. One is still life. We've got the watering can, we've got the candle holder, maybe we have the urn, and then we have the flowers. And so those are 2 different portfolios. All can be a still life, but because we have living things versus non-living things, it divides the portfolio a little bit. So that will be one way that we might decide what we're going to include. The other thing is if you have a balance, so if we have 3 flowers, 3 non-living things, then it blends a little better. And so for that instance, we would want to remove one of the non-living still lifes, and this would be a good choice because we do have that little bit of camera blur, camera motion blur. If we look at the file information here, we can see the camera data. We had 1/60th of a second, which is usually pretty quick. You're able to handhold that pretty well. But if you had just a little bit of movement, then that's when we see this ghosting. And because of that, I would say this one probably should be removed from the series. The other thing that we can see here in the camera data is your lens size. So it calculated your aperture to be f1 greater than f1024. That's actually the maximum that Photoshop will do. And if you've been using glass optics, then it would have been somewhere between, depending on the lens, let's say f1.2, which would be a very wide open hole aperture, to a normal lens would be maybe topped out at f22 or f32 for a regular camera like you have here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take this one out. That leaves us with these other images here. So overall, I think your image quality is pretty acceptable for a pinhole lens. We don't expect super sharp. We can probably tweak this a little bit by using some of those camera raw tools. We can apply it directly to a background layer, but it's often smart to do it as a smart object. So if we use this little flyout, what happens is it turns from background to layer 0, and we show this little symbol here that shows that it's a smart object. So now when we apply the camera raw filter, and this is the exact same engine that we use for looking at that pinhole lens that was a raw file, we can do things like add additional clarity. Maybe we want to add a little bit more contrast, and then we want to go over to this FX tab and maybe dehaze a little bit. And then maybe we want to tweak the colors just a little bit. We can see we've got some highlights peaking. That's going to be this part of the sky. There's no details, so I'm not too worried about that. Maybe we want to increase the shadows a little bit and bring the black points down. This is going to also increase the contrast. Maybe just a little bit more of the clarity, a little bit more vibrance. No, not too much. Not the saturation. Click OK, and you can see how that little bit of extra work just gives it a little bit more polish. The other thing I've noticed in many of the student examples is that we get dust spots. Relatively speaking, your images are very clean. We see a few mostly in these lighter areas, and so when we see that, what we want to do is make a new layer above your background layer and use your spot healing brush tool. Now if you are going to go ahead and do a camera raw filter or any sort of adjustment on that level, you want to do that before you start editing your dust spots out, because otherwise you'll have to redo those. It takes into consideration what's going on with the background layer and making those blends, so that if you change what happened after the fact, then it's just gonna look wrong, basically. And so you can see how just that little couple of seconds, it makes it look much cleaner and much more polished. Another thing you might consider is adding a little bit of contrast with a curves adjustment. We can either do that by adding a little bit of an S curve, and you can see that's like generally loosely S shape. And what happens is once we do that, a little bit of extra contrast I think actually makes the colors a little bit more saturated and vibrant. But it also introduces a few, well, it makes more visible a few extra dust spots. So then we need to go back and tweak those. Now, unlike the caveat I told you about tweaking your background layer, as long as your curves layer is above your edit layer, then you can make these kind of changes and after the fact, and it's not gonna ruin what you had done before you made the curves layer. So what I want to get to here with that point is that your layer order is very important. Same sort of thing here. Finally, I want you to consider your edges a little bit. We have here lots of negative space on the bottom, a little bit of negative space here on the left side, but we're clipping the edge of the watering can and the top of the watering can a little bit. Just changing your camera position a very little bit would allow you to better frame this watering can within your image. Now, of course, it's hard to see with the pinhole lens on there. It's such a small aperture size that it really inhibits the amount of light coming in. So it's difficult. So the key for that kind of thing is take the picture, look at the preview of that image on the back of the camera, and then adjust as needed. Maybe take a half step back and twist your camera up just a little bit. I also like to suggest that while the pinhole has plenty of blurred, background elements are less important, they are still a consideration. And so it looks like you've maybe got some blue rope or hose or something like that here. It's kind of competing a little bit for attention with the can. Now, the blues and the yellows are actually nice complementary colors, and so generally speaking, they fit into a picture very nicely. However, you need to make a way for them to work together rather than just having the blue and the red in the background. If that doesn't make sense, let me know and I'll try to explain that a little better. Overall, I think you're on the right track. You did a nice job. Your images are fairly clean. A little bit of extra post-processing time will make them look even better. Let me know if you have any questions. Overall, I think nice job.